IMF and World Bank are economic enslavers.
We have two parasite organizations, the World Bank, and I want you to look up the International Monetary Fund, the IMF and the WB.
The International Monetary Fund, IMF, faces accusations of imposing difficult conditions on developing countries, most of them in Africa, in exchange for loans.
They told us it was aid. They said it was help. But for millions of Africans, it has become a debt trap, one that drains our resources, ties our future and leaves ordinary people to pay the price. Today we expose how the International Monetary Fund's debt deals are shaping Africa's destiny, and not in our favor. Stay with me. By the end of this video you'll know how real people in Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, Nigeria and beyond are bearing the cost.
IMF and World Bank are economic enslavers. What they are designed to do is to ensure that we are in a perpetual state of debt. You can never get out of IMF and Bretton Woods institutions generally, because they want to ensure that they control your economy, and when they control your economy, they control your politics. That as long as we are dependent on IMF and World Bank, our economies are simply going to be shadow economies of the American economy.
If you believe Africa deserves financial freedom, hit that like button now. And share this with someone who needs to hear the truth. After independence, our dream was sovereignty, to control our resources, steer our destiny, prosper on our own terms. Then came the loans. The IMF said, take this money, ride the crisis, rebuild. What they didn't emphasize, each loan came with conditions: cuts in public spending, devaluation of our currency, privatization of state assets.
Here in the United States, we have two parasite organizations. And when you go home tonight, Dr. Umar is giving you a homework assignment. I want you to look up the World Bank, and I want you to look up the International Monetary Fund, the IMF and the WB. Both of these institutions are headquartered in Washington, D.C. These institutions, their job is to go into Africa and sell false promises with high interest loans, and they bankrupt and sabotage the economies of independent African countries. And the weapon, as Thomas Sankara, that great son of Africa, said, the weapon, as Thomas Sankara said in 1987, the weapon is debt. They use debt as a rope they put around the necks of African heads of state to force them to do what America wants them to do, to force them to do what Britain and France and Holland wants them to do. The reason Africa must stop accepting loans from white parasite countries, the reason I'm so proud of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his decision to stop taking loans and handouts from the West is these loans come with three requirements, brothers and sisters.
The reality. Ordinary Africans paid the price. Subsidies disappeared. Food got more expensive. Public services weakened. According to a recent analysis, decades of IMF-led programs have locked many African nations into cycles of debt, austerity, and dependency, rather than genuine development.
The International Monetary Fund, IMF, faces accusations of imposing difficult conditions on developing countries, most of them in Africa, in exchange for loans. Those conditions are said to have far-reaching consequences on the borrower countries, including interference with internal governance, sinking nations deeper into debt, and creating a larger pool of poor people. Kenneth Rogoff, an American professor who worked as IMF's chief economist, says the lender gives loans to countries with exploding debt to GDP ratios. Simply put, the IMF extends loans to countries already struggling with existing debts. Rogoff gave the example of Ghana, which was already in debt distress in 2021, but the IMF gave it a loan of $1 billion for post-COVID-19 recovery. The IMF, in its assessment report of Ghana in July 2021, said, while noting that risks to Ghana's capacity to repay have increased, IMF's executive directors concurred that they are still manageable. In May 2023, the IMF added Ghana a $3 billion loan despite describing the country's debt as unsustainable. The funding was extended after Ghana defaulted on $30 billion loans in December 2022. But even as the IMF faces accusations of sinking debt-distressed countries, questions about its tough loan conditions continue to be posed. In June 2023, Tunisia's President Kais Saied rejected IMF's conditions for a $2 billion bailout. The IMF had asked Tunisia to restructure over 100 state-owned companies and remove subsidies on food and fuel. In June 2023, the president said IMF's conditions were like putting a matchstick on explosives. In Kenya, the IMF had in July 2022 asked the East African nation to remove maize and fuel subsidies introduced by the then-president Uhuru Kenyatta. Upon assuming office in September 2022, President William Ruto removed the subsidies, saying they were an economic burden. In December that year, IMF approved Kenya's $450 million loan request. IMF says fossil fuel subsidies is the main reason for high carbon emissions and revenue shortage. In its May 2019 report, the lender said if there were no fuel subsidies, global carbon emissions would have been 28% lower and tax revenues higher by 3.8% globally. The IMF says its preconditions, including calls for more taxes, are aimed at removing structural problems that may hamper economic stability. On average, there are about 25 conditions before an IMF loan gets approved. A study done by researchers from the universities of Cambridge and Oxford showed that between 1995 and 2014, the conditions IMF had imposed on 16 West African countries caused governments there to reduce healthcare budgets. The IMF extends two types of loans: a lending arrangement and an outright loan. A lending arrangement requires the borrower to meet conditions before getting a loan, while an outright loan does not have any preconditions. In the early 1980s, many African leaders took IMF and World Bank loans. Conditions including cuts on social spending were set. A World Bank report subsequently showed the number of people living below $1 a day in sub-Saharan Africa doubled from 164 million to 316 million between 1981 and 2001. The IMF and the World Bank are controlled by $1 one vote, and most of the voting shares are held by wealthy nations. The US alone holds enough shares in the IMF to give it veto power.
Let's move from theory to real lives. Kenya, activists recently told the IMF that the Kenyan government's debt and tax burden are driving poverty, with rising taxes, falling incomes, and growing inequality.
If you are IMF, because they are here, what did you do? You are going to see more taxes. Mark my words. You are going to see more reforms. You are going to see more retrenchment. Because you have called us. You are struggling. We can't trace all your money. We don't know where your money goes. You want more money? So that you can dish out. You are going to give you conditions.
You're saying it's going to get worse.
You is good. Please take my word. I'm not a prophet of doom. I love Kenya. This is my home country. All my family and everybody that I love, that love me, they stay in this country. But I'm not talking strictly as an expert on leadership and governance. The beauty is that I've been part of this. I know what, anything that I see happening, I know it is coming from this office.
Ethiopia, the country is restructuring debt after defaulting in 2023. Even with a $3.4 billion IMF program unlocked, huge repayments and reform demands continue to weigh heavily on ordinary people. Senegal, the government is now trying to ramp up tax collection to reduce dependence on external support, including IMF funding, as the previous funding program stalled following misreported debt. In many African countries, the amount governments spend on interest and debt servicing is now higher than what they spend on health or education. These are not distant headlines, they reflect our sisters, our brothers, our neighbors feeling the pain. So what exactly is the mechanism? Currency devaluation. When the IMF recommends floating or devaluing currency, imports become costlier, inflation rises, real wages fall. Spending cuts, public services like health, education and infrastructure often face cuts as part of the deal, hurting the most vulnerable. Debt servicing, even when economies grow slowly, the burden of repayments remains, meaning less money to invest in our future. Loss of sovereignty, with reform conditions, countries often lose policy space, decisions about our economies get influenced by external bodies more than our people.
IMF is now telling Ghana to destroy their economy. How? By ordering Ghana to stop defending its own currency and let the CDI float freely. That sounds technical, but here's what it means. It means Ghana stops buying its own money to keep the price up, while other countries and banks keep selling it. This causes the CDI to lose value, imports like food and fuel become more expensive overnight, and ordinary people see their salaries and savings vanish in real terms. Look at the numbers. Ghana imports over 70% of its refined fuel and much of its food. All of that is priced in US dollars. So when the CDI crashes, the cost of living explodes. Meanwhile, the United States and China do the exact opposite. The US has printed trillions of dollars through quantitative easing to keep its economy afloat. China deliberately holds the yuan down so its exports stay cheap and competitive. Rich nations manipulate their currencies every single day. But when Ghana tries to stabilize its own economy, the IMF steps in and says no. This isn't about helping Ghana, it's about control. Keeping countries dependent, keeping them weak, and making sure the debt keeps flowing back to Washington and Brussels.
For example, research shows in Kenya, rising interest payments on external debt correlate with slower GDP growth. That means less growth, less jobs, fewer opportunities. That's the hidden price ordinary Africans pay. But this is not just a story of defeat. Africa is rising. We hear the call: financial sovereignty, homegrown solutions, Pan-African unity. From west to east, activists, economists, and young leaders are saying, why should we keep borrowing from institutions that profit while our people struggle? Some countries are trying new paths, raising domestic revenue, reducing dependency, exploring debt for development swaps. For example, a debt swap deal in Angola is underway. We must ask, what if Africa financed Africa? What if African resources funded African futures, not foreign agendas? And now, your role matters. Share this video with friends and family. We need our voices heard. Comment below, if you were the leader of your country, would you accept an IMF loan knowing the hidden cost? Why or why not? Subscribe for more Pan-African truth-telling. Hit that bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Because when we talk, share and act, we shift the conversation. We show the world we won't be passive. Remember, Africa doesn't need pity. Africa needs power, the power to decide her future, control her resources, and build on our own terms. The debt chains are real, but so is our possibility. Let's expose the trap together. Let's reclaim the narrative. Because when Africa rises, we all rise. Thanks for watching. Drop the comment, smash the like, and share this widely. This is Afriscope TV. Until next time, stay aware, stay empowered, stay African. Disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this video are based on publicly available information, news sources, and independent analysis. Afriscope TV does not claim to represent any government, political party, or movement. Our goal is to amplify African voices, educate the public, and spark meaningful conversations on global and continental issues. We encourage our audience to engage critically, verify facts independently, and participate in peaceful, lawful civic discourse. This content is for informational and educational purposes only.